Welcome to 2819. I'm Sandra Demas.
And I'm Daniel Almaguer. Wait a minute.
We contradicted each other.
We sure did.
Oh, man.
You know, I think on that note, then we should be talking about contradictions today.
Right. Like, does the Bible contradict itself?
Yep.
Are there any contradictions in science with the Bible? Things like that.
I think so. And in Science Faith Connection, Jeff Zurich will be talking with Ken Samples about understanding contradictions in science and the Bible.
First up is Culture Talk. Sandra's going to be discussing, does the Bible contradict itself, with philosopher Ken Samples.
Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we talk about culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. And I'm joined today with philosopher and theologian Ken Samples. Thank you so much for joining us, Ken.
Hi, Sandra.
We're going to be talking about whether the Bible contradicts itself. So that's kind of a common question or concern that skeptics will have,
Sure.
even something that they'll challenge Christians with, like, hey, you know, I can't believe in the Bible and Christianity itself because the Bible contradicts itself. So I'm wondering, as a philosopher and theologian, you've likely encountered plenty of questions about that.
Yeah.
What are some of the common contradictions that you hear, or alleged contradictions that you hear from skeptics?
I think one that's very big, and it relates to RTB, it relates to the book of Genesis. It's day 4 when the sun and the moon are created. That seems so counter. I mean, you've got plant life before that. That's obviously, it's contrary to science, and it may be contradictory in terms of the creation days itself. So that would be one. Another one would be some of the details relating to the resurrection of Jesus. I mean, were there 2 angels at the tomb? One count says 2, another seems to say 1. So there seems to be these kind of conflicting ideas. One more, now this is a tension less for non-Christians and more for different varieties of Christian. Paul seems to indicate that we're justified by faith, but you read the book of James, and James says we're justified by works. That creates tension within Christianity.
Well, let's kind of unpack some of these. So the first one, it especially pertains to our organization that we work for, Reasons to Believe, because we're looking at the creation days and the order in which things were created. So with regard to day 4, how would someone who holds an old earth creation perspective respond to that concern that there's a contradiction there?
So the old earth folks are going to say, rather than 6 successive 24-hour periods that, Hugh Ross would say these are epochs or these are long eras of time. So the standard interpretation from Hugh would be everything was created in verse 1 of Genesis. Creation is created all at once. And what we find in the successive chapters is kind of an unfolding. It's not that the sun and the moon weren't there, but then they appear. And so there is an unfolding of that kind of thing, rather than there was, plants and things. And of course, plants can't live without the sun. So that would be a way of addressing that would be more consistent in our mind with science.
And I've heard it explained that the creation account is told from the perspective of someone on the surface of Earth. And so from the surface of Earth, the atmosphere was thick. So the sun and the moon did exist, but the atmosphere was such that it couldn't be seen from that perspective. And on day 4, the atmosphere becomes such that you can see.
And that fits the context pretty well. Now, with another contradiction with regard to the angels, well, remember what a contradiction is. That's when 2 statements they clash, they negate or deny one another. They can't both be true. So if one report mentions 2 angels and one report mentions 1 angel, if you've got 2, you've got 1. So it may be they were just reporting a different point of view, not necessarily a clash of ideas. And similarly with Paul and James, I think Paul is saying we are saved by grace, and it is through faith, and it is in Christ. James is simply coming along and saying, but it's not a dead faith. It's always a faith that Luther used to say was pregnant with good works.
Yeah,
right?
I was going to say that, pregnant with good works. I know that quote. I mean, it makes me think of a relationship. If you're in a relationship and you love that person and you state that you love that person and you've vowed to love that person, you still, because of your love, are doing works.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
I kind of envision it that way
Yeah.
to maybe kind of help with that perception that there's a contradiction. It's really this is motivated by faith. So works are motivated by faith.
A lot of the differences are in emphasis rather than, genuine contradictions. And of course, I think that leads us then maybe to offer the advice that you want to make sure it really is a contradiction. You want to make sure you've understood the passage. What kind of genre of literature are we addressing? Psalms is different than, let's say, the book of Genesis or the book of Romans. We also want to look at the words and what do they mean. So coming to have a clearer interpretation can help resolve some of these issues.
Yeah. Well, for Christians who are trying to engage in conversations with other Christians even, but also with skeptics, what would you say? Like maybe are there some resources or some tips on how they can receive a criticism and receive a challenge to their faith and then press into that with exploring deeper? Where would you point them to?
Well, I think understanding the Bible, more about the Bible is good. RTB, our colleague Krista Bontrager has done a number of resources where she talks about interpreting the Bible, looking at the book of Genesis. RTB has a lot of good sources in that regard. I think, again, don't presume that there's going to be a contradiction. Accept the idea that there are tensions and there are challenges, but if you're responsibly interpreting the Bible, I think you're going to be able to work through these things. Ask your pastor, consult good commentaries, talk to people who can help you think through these ideas.
And do you have a particular resource or books? Because I know you love books and you
absolutely.
have a massive library. Do you have any books that you would recommend?
Well, there is a book by Jack Davis. His name is John Jefferson Davis, a handbook of Bible texts. And he arranges key biblical passages in systematic theological order. That's always the first book that I look to when I'm writing or when I'm going to give a talk. It's very handy, very inexpensive.
Yeah. And let's do a little self-plug because I know you've got plenty of books. Which one would you recommend for readers?
I think on an issue like this, I would recommend Christianity Cross-Examined because I look at biblical challenges and biblical tensions, particularly in part 2 of the book.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that, Ken. If you'd like to hear more on this topic, you can go to reasons.org and search for Ken's blog, Reflections. You can also go to support.reasons.org and look for Ken's fine book called Christianity Cross-Examined.
Hello, Jeff Zwerink, and welcome to Science Faith Connection, a segment of our show where we explore interesting scientific ideas and see how they connect to the truth of the Christian faith. Today I'm joined by my friend and colleague Ken Samples, and we're going to explore the topic of Bible contradictions. Ken, good to have you on the show today.
Hello, Jeff.
So there's a common idea out there that there's a lot of contradictions in the Bible. And I think if there were genuine contradictions, that would really argue against the truth of Christianity because the Bible is supposed to be a revelation from God. So I went, looked up on an atheist website, just some of the contradictions. I want to read a couple and just kind of get your response to them. So one of them is the Sabbath day. There's a passage in Exodus. It says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. But then Paul says in Romans, one man esteems one day above another, another esteemed every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. Or there's another one where it talks about seeing God, and Jacob is wrestling with God. It says, I have seen God face to face and my life is preserved. But John later says, no man has seen God at any time. So these are touted as contradictions to the Bible. Yeah. How do you respond to these contradictions?
Well, a contradiction is a very specific thing in logic. It's what we would say is a and non-a. Nothing can both be and not be at the same time in the same way. To put it in terms of information or facts, nothing can be true and false at the same time in the same way.
Okay.
Now, looking at those two specific examples, let's take the Sabbath issue. It's true that Judaism worshiped on the Sabbath day, sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, so they had a Saturday Sabbath. Christians, however, began to worship on Sunday because they saw it as the Lord's Day. They saw it as the day that Christ rose from the dead. So they weren't repudiating the Sabbath, they were recognizing that Sunday was a unique day in which Christ rose from the dead. So I don't see how those two things are contradictions. It could be that God is revealing things, and you can be a Christian and keep the Sabbath, but it's true, Christians worshiped on Sunday. I don't see that as a contradiction.
So it almost seems like when we're looking at the Bible, or any supposed Bible contradiction, we have to look at the context of each one and see, is this really saying the same thing, or saying two contradictory things, or is this from one perspective, this from another, something like that?
Yeah, and looking at the other alleged contradiction, well, it's true. There are people in the Old Testament who seem to have kind of encounters or visions of a religious nature, maybe seeing God, so to speak. And then in the New Testament, it does say that nobody can see God. But I think the appropriate context is nobody can see God in his essence. No one can encounter this infinite, eternal God in his full essence. It's not saying that people didn't have religious experiences where they thought they saw God working in their lives. I don't think either of those are serious contradictions. I think there are challenges in the Bible that are more serious than that. So, but simply because things are inconsistent don't mean they're contradictory.
So maybe these aren't the best examples. Let's deal with what are some of the things that genuinely appear contradictory, or that are bigger issues to deal with. What are some that you would say?
Well, I think if you were to look at maybe the central ideas of Scripture or the truth claims of Scripture, I think if you could maybe look at the resurrection and say, well, it seems as if the Bible is saying one thing about the resurrection over here and then another one over here. Not all of the data supporting the resurrection falls into perfect categories of consistencies. But I think when you look at that data as a whole, you can say, well, there is a way of explaining this kind of thing. And I think another thing that works in all of this, Jeff, is that Christians do believe in mystery, and a mystery would be like Jesus being both God and man. Now, I don't know exactly how Jesus is God and man. There are Christians who have proposed theories about how a single person could have a divine and human nature, but I don't think that the incarnation is a contradiction. I don't know I can't fully comprehend it, but I don't think it's a contradiction.
Well, your example there, Jesus' nature, that's getting at the heart of humanity. The Trinity has been raised as a contradiction. Is God one or is God three?
That's right.
So let's kind of deal with the logic aspect of it. Let's stick with the Trinity. Is God being one and God being three a contradiction or not?
Well, I would say if we're saying that God is one and not one, three and not three, that seems like A and non-A. That seems like a contradiction. But of course, Christianity, and I'm thinking of the great church fathers, I'm thinking of Thomas Aquinas, the medieval scholar, Protestant thinkers, have always argued that the way that God is one, his essence or being, is different than the way he's three, his subsistence or personhood. So what we could say is God is one in category A, essence, but he's three in category B, personhood. So it's not A and non-A. The law of non-contradiction says it has to be at the same time and in the same way. God's oneness and threeness are not in the same categories.
Well, it just struck me here that when we're talking about Jeff Zweerink or Ken Samples, I'm one person with one essence.
Right.
And so, in some sense, when I'm dealing with the Trinity, I'm dealing with categories that are so foreign to my existence that it might appear contradictory when it really is just bigger than I can deal with.
That's exactly right. And I think that also includes the incarnation. Jesus is a single person, but his divinity and his humanity, they don't mix, they don't mingle, they're not blurred together, they do not negate one another. So the incarnation and the Trinity are genuine mysteries, but they can be articulated in a way in which they don't appear to be genuine contradictions.
You know what's interesting is that we talk about this in terms of theology and is Christianity contradictory, but I see this same phenomena play out in science. There's loads of experiments where it's like, what's going on here? Can we explain what it is? But I think even just when we talk about quantum mechanics, there's the wave-particle duality, that everything is both a wave and a particle. Well, you can't be a wave and a particle, except that the way it's a wave is different than the way it's a particle, or what experiment you're doing. It sounds a lot like the mystery we're dealing with here. It's not a contradiction, it's a mystery. So I find the same phenomena playing itself in science. How do you think about that?
I think that that's right. I think that there are plenty of things that we can't fully comprehend, whether it's in science, whether it's in philosophy, whether it's in theology. But simply because we can't fully comprehend them doesn't mean that it's an actual logical contradiction. And in one of my books, Christianity Cross-Examined, I use quantum mechanics and I look at it from that standpoint, that it can be a mystery, not a contradiction. The same way I think it applies to the Trinity and to the incarnation.
So when you encounter a contradiction in the Bible, how do we approach that? What would you recommend to someone who says, hey, this looks contradictory? How do we go about dealing with that?
Well, the Bible is a book. It is a series of books. It is a document, if you will. It's written in language. I think we have to approach it and say, what's the context that we're reading here? What's the original language? How does this passage in the Old Testament then relate to this other passage in the New Testament? That is, I think we should treat differences or challenges in the Bible the way we would approach them in other historical documents. And usually you're able to come to some way of reconciling those things.
Well, thanks, Ken. I really appreciate your comments. We want to often portray as though Christianity is the place with contradictions. But the reality of it is when we look at science, whether we're looking at quantum mechanics, whether we're looking at the Trinity, there are things that appear mysterious to us. And those supposed contradictions, if we handle them properly, force us to dive deeper and gain a greater understanding of what's going on. And we see that both in theology and in science. I'd encourage you to go to reasons.org. Ken's got a great blog. It's titled The Difference Between Mystery and Contradiction. Gives you great tools to explore how we can use these purported contradictions to get a better understanding of who God is, who Christ is, and how we can know him better.
We hope this contradictory episode of 2019 has helped equip you to share your faith with compassion and confidence.
But not contradictions.
Right.
Yeah. I think we learned a lot from, especially Ken Sample, since he was on 2 segments, just really understanding how to know some common contradictions and then how to respond to them. I think that's pretty cool. And I really hope that people are excited, just as I was, to learn about the alleged contradiction with regard to day 4 in creation.
Right, definitely. And again, I think his book, Christianity Cross-Examined, is an awesome resource for anyone to pick up.
For sure. Well, you know what? You might also want to pick up your phone and subscribe to the show, and also search for us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We'd love for you to follow us. We're at 2819 Show. We'd like to hear your thoughts.
And if you would like to listen to the audio version of the show, you can search us on most major podcast sites. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast.
We'll see you next week.
See ya.